My name is Rajan Harshe. I have been teaching political science and international relations for more than 4 decades, and I have primarily taught in University of Hyderabad, Department of Political Science, and I also taught in Department of International Relations, South Asian University. I will be speaking on understanding globalization in the post-Cold War phase. Basically, I will try to deal with salient features of globalization. But before we start, let me give you my idea of what is globalization. Globalization in terse terms signifies compression of time and space. It also signifies free flow of ideas, free flow of knowledge, free flow of goods and services, free flow of trade, finance, capital, free flow of currencies, free flow of terror, diseases. So, it's a kind of borderless world where somewhere world is being treated as a single unit, and that's how globalization can be understood. The entire process of globalization has been stimulated by the information communication technology, and there are so many ups in this particular technology that it is moving rapidly, and that rapid change in ICT also is reflecting the process of globalization. When I chose post-Cold War phase, I am aware of the historical antecedents of globalization. Sometimes people say that when ideas were exchanged, even Greek ideas were exchanged between ancient India and the Greece. Sometimes people say when Vasco da Gama reached Calicut, that is how the globalization and modernization period began. I am aware of all this. But I am talking about this particular phase because this is significant in world politics and contemporary international relations. Why it is significant? Because after 1991, the Cold War ended. That means somewhere, if capitalism had a challenge from socialist society and socialist world in terms of building a better society, in terms of production, distribution, exchange, then that particular challenge was lost. Socialism and socialist ideas began to fall into disrepute with the fall of the Soviet Union and with the fall of Stalinist regimes in East European countries, particularly Romania, which was such a Stalinist regime of Ceausescu. So socialism was discredited, and what happened was capitalism as a mode of production and capitalism as a world system emerged as a dominant system in world economy and also world politics. Now, what is capitalism? I would not like to define it, but I'll just tell you a few features of capitalism to make sense of capitalism. One, that it is a social product, organization of production where means of production are privately or corporately owned. Capitalism comes into existence when there is wage labor. There is a conflictual and cooperative relationship between wage labor and capital in capitalism. There is also socialization of production, but private accumulation of profits. And lastly, capitalism leads to accumulation of capital, and because it's a global system, that accumulation takes place on a global scale. So in essence, this particular reality, that private or corporate ownership of the means of production is preeminent now across the world, and most importantly, all those countries, Soviet Union, its former East European allies, Afro-Marxist countries of erstwhile like Angola, Ethiopia, Mozambique, they all have now turned themselves towards building healthy capitalist societies. And what is more, even China has been building capitalism methodically for past more than 40 years. They have state-directed capitalism, which is unique. Capitalism with Chinese characteristics, and that under Xi Jinping leadership is being built. Now, if this is the reality, then capitalism and globalization are interconnected. Actually, capitalism is agent of globalization. And at the same time, somewhere, in my view, if it is agent, it is also kind of intertwined with globalization too. But you can't reduce globalization as a phenomena to capitalism alone. globalization is also much more complex. This must be underscored. I would also like to then state quickly that somewhere globalization shows the limits of the power of nation states. And what are the limits, or why do they come? I think individual nations or collectively group of nations also cannot handle mammoth tasks which globalization has posed, and they can't be answered, they cannot be addressed, and that's where you require institutions of global governance all the more. I will give you an example like climate change across the world. One nation or group of nations of Europe can't handle it. It is affecting the entire planet. There is also an example of nuclear non-proliferation. As if we want to denuclearize the world, I think it can be only handled by global governance. Problems related to human rights, they can't be handled by only nation states. Problems related to transnational terrorism. You have multinational terrorist organizations coming up all over, and I'll come to it a little later. But they cannot be handled. You require global institutions to handle global problems, and it is where the global institutions have to be necessary. Some measure of global institutions are always functioning, and they are functioning, which we call them international regimes. Now, international regime is one where states sign a treaty and bring it into existence. International Monetary Fund, World Bank, or World Trade Organization, these are classic examples how international regimes have been formed. And they are very powerful. All the three regimes which I mentioned just now, IMF, World Bank, and World Trade Organization. And they are regulating the world in the area of trade, in the area of blank loans, in the area of exchange, in terms of development. And these are very important organizations which have emerged as international regimes. And they are partly governed globally. Not that there is some kind of democracy in their governance. Countries like United States or European countries together, they are very powerful in these organizations. But that is a different matter. Another thing that I would like to say that the flow of internet and role of internet has changed so drastically that we have technological giants emerging in this area like Facebook, Google, and somewhere social media is also very important under globalization, but there is no consensual mechanism among all the nation states how to regulate it. While internet is international, universal sometimes, there is also something like national political sovereignty which wants to control the flow of information that comes from internet. And this is going to be an unresolved problem for some time to come. But I wanted to mention only passingly that you have to have global institutions of global concerns. Otherwise, globalization as a phenomena cannot be managed. Looking back at it, when we look at 1991, when the Cold War ended, United States was a prominent champion of globalization, and George Bush, the then president, senior Bush, inaugurated the new world order, which will be libertarian world order, and liberalism and new rule-based liberalism would be followed in the world all over. That was the hope. So there will be democracy, there will be capitalism, their marriage, and liberal world order. That's what America tried to plead for. America was, and it had emerged as a sole military superpower after the Cold War. But I would like to mention here that same United States which spoke this language in 1991, by 2017 it reversed its stand when Trump assumed presidential office in 2017. Trump basically began to emphasize the policy of America first, and he didn't want to subscribe to grand visions that America talked about in terms of taking global responsibility, promoting new world order, promoting liberal order. And that is how Trump took steps which showed America is not America the way it used to be, because United States withdrew from Paris Climate Accords. It also withdrew from the idea of Trans-Pacific Partnership. United States, Russia, and some other major powers have party to comprehensive plan of action in 2015 dealing with Iran's nuclear power and how to dismantle Iran's nuclear capacities and use it for peaceful purposes. They're working towards it, but that deal also was set off. United States also began to oppose free trade. It opposed migrations, and somewhere United States began to emerge as a country of white racist supremacists in some way. Somewhere United States was losing jobs because of globalization. They used to say jobs are Bangalored. That means people from Bangalore and other parts are taking jobs of Americans at much cheaper price. So somewhere United States changed this policy. So what is the power structure of world under globalization? How does one understand it? I would say it is not unipolar world. We are heading towards a multipolar world. At the same time, I would like to caution, United States still continues to be one of the important powers in the world. It has all the wherewithal and components of major power, like it has technology, finance, it has security related complexes which are very powerful, and it has knowledge producing apparatuses which are very powerful. All people try to get admission in Harvard, Yale, Chicago, and best of the American universities, knowledge producing apparatuses. It's a powerful country. But then it is not the only powerful country. China is chasing United States very fast, and it is second most powerful country. Most powerful in Asia, but second most powerful country in all over the world. And it has emerged very strong militarily, with his population, trained manpower, with his finances, capacity to aid, capacity to kind of build infrastructures across, capacity to compete with United States, his presence in South China Sea, Indian Ocean, India-Pacific region. China has surely emerged. Russia also, it is trying to restore its old status of a superpower by playing a very major role in Central Asia, in East Europe too. And Russia is also emerging under Putin as a major power. Brazil is important in Latin America. South Africa is important in Southern Africa particularly, but Africa as a whole. Then among the European powers, Germany is important, and it is strong power. It is virtually magnet around which the European Union is woven, interwoven, I would say. And Japan also is very important financial power. I would consider India also is emerging as a major power. It can't be denied. It is one of the most powerful countries in South Asia, the most powerful, and in Asia, one of the most powerful countries, and it is emerging and knocking the doors of Security Council of United Nations for admission. So you need not necessarily say that P5 countries, which are most powerful countries, should lead the Security Council. Security Council membership also has to be extended. Somewhere it has to be more democratized. Somewhere India, Brazil, South Africa, Germany, Japan, which are knocking at the door to enter Security Council of United Nations, they have to be considered too. And this is important problem, and this particular demand for new kind of global governance is a very legitimate demand. I would go further and say that globalization has also brought home the existence of transnational civil society. I think there is global civil society emerging where there are transnational classes constituted by bureaucrats, by captains of industry who are mobile, who are striking deals, bank employees of international class, and there is also transnational civil society involves several NGO groups like human rights groups, child labor, people who are fighting for child labor, people who are kind of working towards development at large. There are many NGOs which are working. So NGOs constitute civil society, while the captains of industry, trade, manufacturing, and sometimes even leading statesmen and heads of the governments, they also constitute this society. I would consider that if you look at life somewhere, there is something like World Economic Forum which meets regularly. More often it meets at Davos very regularly. And you have meeting of captains of industry, captains of business, and different heads and heads of governments and heads of states. So you have a kind of group which is trying to make a world policy in the economic arena and world political economy, and that has already emerged. Actually, what they are working out is pathways towards developing capitalism across the world, and that is emerging. Now, if this is happening, there is also opposing forum, Quaternion Forum, which is opposing or trying to subvert that unbridled exploitative aspect of capitalism, and that is World Social Forum. This is constituted by a large number of NGOs across the world. There is a network of NGOs which is working in this, and World Social Forum also meets everywhere. Only time I thought in a very major way they made their presence felt was in 1999 when Seattle Conference of Ministers of World Trade Organization took place. The NGOs protested very vehemently to find a place on the negotiating table. So they considered that civil society also should have a place apart from politicians and heads of the states or governments to kind of participate in the future of the world, because they constituted part of the transnational civil society. There is another development which I must mention, which is a major salient feature of globalization, is rise of regions and rise of regional organizations. Regions are defined in different ways in different times in world history, but advent of regions is very important phenomenon. Regional organizations are a way to respond to the phenomena of globalization. That is how I would put it. Now, most successful region I would consider is European Union. Brexit took place in 2016 and Britain withdrew, but still European Union is accommodating 27 other countries. And European Union has euro as a currency. It has free flow of trade, free flow of goods, free flow of ideas, knowledge, and it is kind of working very efficiently, a very major organization indeed. There is also another trading bloc, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, a very major group which kind of constitutes 600 million people almost, and this particular group also is important in my view as a trading bloc. There is North African Free Trade Agreement in United States, Canada and Mexico. United States signed it and brought Mexico into kind of picture, although they had to kind of compromise the standards of labor when they brought it, and environment too. And constantly America was worried if Mexico is not brought in, Japan and Germany might compete with the United States, and that's how NAFTA, it has Canada and Mexico, and that's an important organization. But if you look at different regions per se, there is always one major power around which the region is interwoven, regional organization is interwoven. Examples being Economic Community of West Africa, where Nigeria virtually leads it. It's the dominant country, most populated, most developed relatively, and it leads that ECOWAS. If you look at Southern African Development Community in Southern Africa, it is South Africa which is playing the major role. And if you look at South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, SAARC, then it is India which is at the core of SAARC. I think no cooperation or cooperative development project in SAARC is conceivable without India's active participation in it. So region and regionalism also is a significant response to globalization. I talked about international regimes, I talked about rise of regions and regionalism, I talked about international civil society. Now, within all this, where do you locate the normal nation state, which is so important as an agency? I would consider nation state still continues to be primary actor in world politics under globalization as well. I would say also that it is going through existential strains, because nation states is being pressurized from above by organizations like World Trade Organization. If they are developing countries, surely on trade related matters. It is pressurized by IMF. It is pressurized by World Bank. Even loans are advanced by international financial institutions. If you hold democratic elections in Africa, loans were advanced after this as a precondition. Point is that nation state is suffering from the pressures from above and it has to manage them. But pressures from above are not just significant, there are also pressures from below. Pressures from below come from national groups which are trying to secede or find autonomy within a nation state. And this challenge from within is coming in Quebecois in Canada, Basque in Spain, or entire Africa is full of such secessionist movements. In Sri Lanka, the Tamilians tried to challenge the main regime, and then Tamilian movement through LTT, which came up, was suppressed. The point to be noted here is that this is a phenomena everywhere. India has them too, sometimes Northeast, sometimes Kashmir. There are these problems which you can't get over. And secessionist movements can cause existential state for nation state, existential strain. So somewhere nation state at one level is too small for globalizing world and it is too large for local and ethnic movements, and that's how it stands today. This strain, how long it will whether go on and how long nation state will negotiate with it is very difficult to work out, but it is so far negotiating very intelligently, it is surviving and hitting back. Sometimes we are limiting the process of globalization. Last and not the least, but very important issue that I would like to mention, that is entire process of globalization has witnessed emergence of multinational terrorist organizations. Al-Qaeda being the most prominent of the multinational terrorist organizations with its branches over 80 countries. But it is not just kind of this particular organization which is strong. It has alliance with Boko Haram of West Africa. It has alliance with Al-Shabaab of East Africa. So Al-Qaeda is a very powerful multinational terrorist organization. And its strength Al-Qaeda showed when on 9/11 Twin Towers of New York were brought down. So it is a very important terrorist organization. To fight Al-Qaeda or to fight Islamic State, which is another important international organization run by radical Islam, you have to have coalition of countries at a global level to work out counter-terrorism strategies. Otherwise, globalization and its process will be halted or punctured and subverted by terrorist organizations, because they also get the advantage of global technology, global ICT, the terrorists, and they also can attack as citadels of capitalism. So this is how what happens is, small conflicts have the capacity to be global, and global gets reflected in something local. And local and global are always interconnected. Multinational terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda came because of the Afghanistan war. There is a long history to it. But then for a long time, Osama bin Laden led it. And I would like to end by saying that, look, if Microsoft and Bill Gates connected you all over the world, then somewhere Al-Qaeda also connected you, and Osama bin Laden and Bill Gates, they are two sides of the same coin. Now these are the realities, and we have to understand that globalization is a phenomena that is going to stay, and we have to understand it. It's a continuous process, ongoing project, and I gave you some of the silent ideas how we can understand it. Globalization is such a complex world, and I talked about terrorism. I would like to make a plea that, just as Bill Gates gave you Microsoft and connected you all over in the world, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda used that to connect terrorists across the world. Somewhere, Osama bin Laden and Bill Gates are two sides of the same coin. That's how globalization operates. It has to be understood that way. I would like to kind of talk about one more issue before I turn to India, and that is pressing issue of Corona and how post-COVID world will be, and that's an issue we have to kind of address. I would consider that earlier we had AIDS, SARS, and many pandemics, but this particular pandemic has shaken the entire world. It is absolutely unprecedented, perhaps more unprecedented than Spanish flu itself. And United States, the mightiest of the country, lost so many lives. Indians also have lost largest number of people in Corona, through Corona deaths, and this is continuing. So far, Britain, Italy, France, every European country practically has gone through it. India is constantly facing it, and there is no end to it, and there is neither a proper solution nor will we know where will it end. But somewhere people have to come together under globalization, which they are coming, and health infrastructure has been neglected so far, and world has to think in terms of how health infrastructure can be strengthened in the days ahead. That is the important issue which all countries have to address collectively through global institutions like World Health Organization, and individually countries have to address them too. I would now come down to kind of repercussions of globalization as a phenomenon on India. First point that I would like to make, because we began in post-Cold War world, in 1991, when Soviet Union collapsed, India lost a very major trading partner. And that particular time, India's economy was doing it was in shambles. It was doing so badly that India had merely $1 billion worth of foreign exchange reserves, which is negligible for a country of our size. And then what actually happened was India was forced to go for reforms. So reforms were brought in India, economic reforms and liberalization, because of the compulsion rather than conviction. What did reforms, what do they entail? One thing that I would like to say, that reforms basically wanted to rely on cutting salaries and subsidies, closing down sick public sector units which were disadvantaged and non-profiting, opening the economy to direct foreign investments, and also bringing about some kind of semblance of growth in a malfunctioning economy through macroeconomic planning. And that Dr. Manmohan Singh and Prime Minister Rao in those days tried to steer through. They tried to build a consensus around reform, and India began to navigate reforms and began to go ahead with the idea of reforms. I would like to say that reforms had its major kind of good points as well as bad points. In the sense, reforms, India is a union of states, and somewhere states in the union, they had developed unevenly for a very long time, and reforms only aggravated this uneven development among the states. The states in southern India like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Andhra, they grew very fast. So are Maharashtra and Gujarat. They also grew very fast. But northern states, particularly Hindi belt of Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, they trailed behind very much more. Similarly, because of reform, there was an ICT revolution because telecommunication sector was open. And what happened was in southern parts and western parts also, technology hub and technology parks emerged. That's why Bangalore became a kind of software people's city, one kind of Silicon Valley. Bangalore, Hyderabad, Chennai, Pune, they all emerged as IT cities, and this was a very major achievement. I would also like to say that there's something interesting happened. Chandrababu Naidu, when he was Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, he sought World Bank loan. And when he sought World Bank loan, he approached World Bank and got the loan and went for reforms directly. There's no Council of States, so somewhere he should have sought permission from domestic authorities, but he got the World Bank loan. Now that's how uneven development has caused inequalities. There are inequalities within states, there are inequalities among states, and India is struggling through the phase of reforms. But I would also like to say that for a long time, for almost 25 years, India witnessed steady growth at an average of 6 to 7% after reforms. And that's an important development because earlier we had only Hindu rate of growth of 3 to 3.5%, which was nothing. And growth is quantitative, it can be calculated, and development is qualitative. Development involves extension of franchise, it can involve employment to everybody, education to everybody, health system for everybody. So development was possible. Only through growth, and they had to go together, and India managed the show. I would also like to mention here that India also activated the SAARC as an organization, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. Afghanistan became its 8th member, but somehow SAARC has not been moving the way India would have liked to because of the constant rivalry between Pakistan and India. India can cooperate with other neighbors like Bhutan, Bangladesh, Nepal, but Pakistan is a major hurdle in the cooperation in the SAARC. That's why it is not a vibrant organization as it used to be. It should be. However, India inaugurated its Look East policy under Narasimha Rao, and under Modi it has become Act East policy, and India has developed substantial amount of relationship with Southeast Asian countries. There are development cooperation projects with Southeast Asian countries of ASEAN. Among the important project that was completed was Mumbai-Pune highway by Malaysia. So there are such kind of developments which need to be appreciated. India also succeeded in the reform period to kind of rebuild its relationship with United States. Actually, what happened was that India became a nuclear power. America was virtually boycotting it, but somewhere the deal between India and America for nuclear peace, peaceful purposes of nuclear energy was stuck, and India could move ahead in its relationship with United States. Russia has been an important friend of India for a long time, and defense-related equipments India also purchased from Russia all along, and it continues to do so. France has been among the major supporters of India as far as European Union is concerned. India's only kind of sometimes rivalry or competition is is with China. That China trades with India, it has trade surplus with India, and India is not able to match up to that trade. China also has a kind of tension with India as far as border is concerned, as far as Tibet issue is concerned, and Chinese expansionist strategy Indians do not approve of. Pakistan is China's ally somewhere, and Pakistan is being constantly deployed by China to humble India, and there is a pressure exerted to Pakistan, and China and Pakistan both are interested in building Belt Road Initiative. They're implementing Belt Road. China is implementing Belt Road Initiative, and part of the problem is the road goes through Pakistani occupied Kashmir. So these are the problems for India under globalization. The China's ambition, it has BRI project, and India has to somewhere contain and meet Chinese power, whether it is on the land or whether in the seas. China also has become major Indian Ocean power, and it meets India. And how China is contained by India in forthcoming years, whether in Malacca Straits or whether in Indo-Pacific region by allies or through building relationship with Southeast Asia, that's a major challenge. So I think if I have to sum up, I have covered several areas to explain post-Cold War globalization, given you definition of globalization, capitalism, international regimes, rise of transnational institutions, rise of transnational civil society, and role of regional organizations, role of nation states, and I would consider that this is one area, globalization, which is constantly needs our reappraisal to see that we are up to date and dynamic with the developments to kind of get complete hold of what we are talking. And I only gave you some measures to see how it can be seen, a perspective, whether we can analyze and understand phenomena of globalization itself by keeping also the entire world, but at the end, attaching what India must be undergoing during this particular phase. Thank you.